Now, one of the things I really do enjoy in history is how often nations facing and people facing similar problems come up with similar solutions. We sometimes call this convergent development, and it is one of the facts of humanity. It's also one of the facts which makes it such an interesting debate when people go, who developed what first? And when people try and claim things and go, this belongs to this culture or this belongs to this people, and you sit there and go, well, yeah, but to what extent does it? To what extent? Now, the Unryū class of light fleet carriers for Japan are a classic example of this. I once read in a book, and this was an interesting little book on development of aircraft carriers, that they were Japan copying the Royal Navy's light fleet carriers. There's just a small issue with this as a reality. The fact is, the Royal Navy's light fleet carriers, which are based on the unicorn design tree that was developed to support the illustrious class. So, basically, Unicorn is a forward aviation support ship, not a carrier. She's a forward aviation support ship. She's an auxiliary, not a carrier. Whatever you might think when you look at her and all those things, she's not a carrier. And that had been developed theoretically from various programs which were developed and studies which were going on things to support the fleet carriers which were being built under the treaty limitations of the Second London Treaty and, the tonnage limitations of it. These things had an impact, and to try and make it work, to try and make what the British wanted out of their carriers work and get enough carriers, they decided they needed an aviation support ship to assist them. And then when they get into war, well, it turns out that same design, if you take some things out of it and you modify it just a little bit, it can turn into an excellent fleet carrier, or rather light fleet carrier. And it turns out that same light fleet carrier design can, with a few things added in, be turned back into an aviation support ship. It's amazing. It's amazing. But the thing is, at no point do the Japanese copy this from the British. The reason I can say this confidently is that they are pretty much being built and designed at exactly the same time. In fact, their timeline looks almost exactly the same. And the class of ships which come into service, well, yes, they do look like a Japanese design tree light fleet carrier, unsurprisingly. There is two classes, theoretically, of this, the Unryū and the Ikoma. But I would say also there are enough differences across some of the designs that, frankly, calling them a class is sometimes a difficult thing to do. This is the Japanese class of carriers, which has the most in common with French pre-dreadnought construction. In that, whilst I'm certain the yards received the same starting designs, they all seem to have evolved the designs as they felt. And they did plan 16 of them. They planned 16. They completed 3. Broadly speaking. And 13 are cancelled at various points in construction. The ones which are closest to completion or completed, I'm going to be showing pictures of them, and of course, the new Cloud in itself is there. She is built by Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, and she used the same boilers, turbines, and other things as a heavy cruiser, the Susanoo, was going to use. And so, she was built with as much commonality, and the whole design was built with as much commonality as they could, with existing vessels under construction to make it easy, to make it quick, to make it possible to assemble these en masse because they realized they needed them. And they needed them desperately. And that's not unusual. That's not unusual. Light fleet carriers are something you order when you realize that you have to maximize your production and you have to build something as quickly as you can to churn out numbers of flight decks. That is what a light fleet carrier is about. It's about numbers of flight decks. The interesting thing with these ships and all the emergency programs, realistically, is that the Japanese carrier program and ship procurement is far ahead of the warming up of the fighter and torpedo bomber and dive bomber pilot training program, which probably needs to be churned out at quite a high degree as well. But you see, it always has been the way. For Japan, it was always a case of we build the ships, we plan to build the ships, and then we grow the force to meet the ships when they come in. We don't grow the force at the same time as we're building the ships. We don't grow the force before we have the ships. And you can understand why, to the extent of their logistics, the realities of their population, all these things. But the thing is, the Japanese population wasn't that small. The Japanese population today is not that small. The example I usually give is the UK has roughly 70 million people, and Japan has over 120 million. Over 120 million. I think they're getting they're close to 124. But the thing is, Japan's always had quite a large population relative to its size. It's been able to, thanks to improvements in agriculture, but also in the that was a main advantage for it in the 20s and 30s. It did have the population. It didn't have the economy, but it had the population. So let's consider the ships. And at this point, things get kind of interesting because the ship stats, when I'm talking about this class as a key ship, it's more in the point of they're a key ship in that they show that Japan has realized they're in a situation and they need to try and get something out there. That they do not have the mass they need for the scenario they're facing, and they need to find a way to get more mass into service. But unfortunately, the vitals doesn't really back up that thesis because displacement. Unryū and Amagi, 17,500 long tons, roughly 17,760 tons, normal tons in standard. The others were slightly less than that, 1,150 long tons. That's 17,425 tons in standard. So there's a 335 ton differential going on. Length, roughly the same. They were all roughly 746 foot overall. Beam, roughly 72 foot, and draft, roughly 26 foot. Okay? And you might notice there are actually, the official stats are up there, but I'm not saying the official stats, I'm giving you the rough ones, because there are the official stats for the class, and then there are some of the stats I've read about individual members of the ships of the class, and they vary. They do vary. Some are listed at 746 foot. Some are listed at 745.8. Some are listed as a draft of 25.9. Some as a draft of 26. Some as a draft of 25.7. So I'd say roughly set 26 foot, you won't be wrong. If you were taking that ship in the harbour and you went, I think I'm acting as if I have a draft of 26 foot, which means I want to go in water no shallower than 30 foot, you would be perfectly safe and sensible. And in Japan, there's actually quite a lot of harbours like that, because just remember, Japan builds up to the coast and then builds out into the coast. There are large parts of Japan, even in the 30s and 40s. I mean, nothing like modern day, but even in the 30s and 40s, where they have already built to the point at which there is no beach. There is no graduation. They have built out as far as they could build out with the technology they had at the time, and they have built up so that the port is already in deep water. Power, roughly the same for all the ships, roughly. Because there's 8 Rogo Kampon water tube boilers to drive 4 Kampon geared turbine ends, achieving 104,000 shaft horsepower for Katsuragi and Aso. All the others got 152,000 shaft horsepower. So Katsuragi and Aso could only achieve 32 knots, the others could all theoretically get 34 knots. Notice Katsuragi and Aso are not the two who are the slightly heavier ships either. This is what I mean by this design. The other thing I suppose I could say is they're kind of like the post-World War II Daring class destroyers of the Royal Navy, where they have, to try out the best form of energy generation, they have 4 with DC power, 4 with, different voltages, different wattages, etc. 4 with AC, and they have them in different configurations, so there's no more than 2 ships in any one configuration. But they're actually doing that to test things out. They are literally doing that to test out systems. The Japanese are trying to build this as a class. Believe it or not, their High Command are really trying to build this as a class, so there'd be as much commonality as possible. They're just not really getting there successfully. All of the vessels were supposed to carry 3,750 tons of oil. All of them were supposed to carry. Some possibly didn't have tanks that big, some had tanks bigger. Again, not much differential. It's a differential of about 50 tons either way, but yeah. They're still a good class, don't get me wrong. I could point to other classes, I could point to various allied classes, I could point to the Essexes, which do have some variance across them. And that's normal. Apart from the Essexes are well into double digits in terms of numbers constructed, and are constructed at a pace through war where people are trying to involve upgrades and various solutions which are coming from wartime experience as they're building them. Whereas these are emergency builds, so these are closer to the light fleet carriers, but also I suppose the American conversion, American light fleet carriers, etc. In that they're supposed to be as cheap as chips and as in service as quickly as possible, so they can provide the flight decks you need in service. Complements could vary between 1100 and 1600, depending on mission or unit. Radar, well, Unryū and Amagi were supposed to be were built with 2 Type 21 radars, as built, top of island and flight deck, and a single Type 13 radar on the mast. Katsuragi, as built, had 2 Type 21 radars, top of island and flight deck, and 2 Type 13 radars on the mast and radio antenna. Amagi and Katsuragi in 1945 had only a single Type 21 radar on the flight deck, a single Type 22 radar on top of the island, and a single Type 13 radar on the mast. There's some changes going on. Sonars, hydrophones, well, it depends on which ship you're talking about, what they're having. Amagi gets the... And I'm sorry, I haven't italicized Amagi there. I have everywhere else, but not there. Why have I not? I don't know. Type 93 hydrophone. Type 3 active sonar. The others, a Type 0 hydrophone and a Type 3 active sonar. You're probably sitting there looking at me going, Alex, this is... How many ships are built here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, not a lot. Out of the 16 ordered. Out of the 16 ordered, There are only 3 completed. Only 3 completed. However, some get further along in construction than others. Some do get further along in construction than others. And this is why we tend to talk about some of the other ships and their designs. For example, the Asso, which is mentioned here, has some changes to it done, and differentials in it. Well, she's being built at Kure Naval Arsenal, the same as Katsuragi, and she was 60% complete, and it was Kure Naval Arsenal which was making some changes. Hence, yeah, it's the Kure Naval Arsenal vessels which have the 104,000 shaft horsepower. Because they make slightly different boilers and slightly different turbines. So that's what they have to do. It's the way things go. But if we carry on, then we have a look at their armament. And again, all had 6 twin 127mm, that's 5-inch, 8 Type 89 AA guns. It's good to have. 21 triple mounts, 30 single mounts out of Type 96 25mm AA guns. Honestly, they could probably have done better with having a group of people sneezing at enemy aircraft, but, you know, hey, they are morale, they do provide morale, and they don't have anything better. 30 depth charges. I have no earthly reason why a carrier would be carrying depth charges. I realize American submarines are a massive problem, but if your response to that massive problem is your carriers are going to try and depth charge enemy submarines, then you have the problem, not the submarines and not the carriers. You have the problem, and it's deep and psychological. There are many things your carrier should be doing in a circumstance where a submarine is nearby it. Trying to stick depth charges on it is not one of them. Unryū and Amagi had also 6 times 28 mounts of 4.7-inch AA rockets. So it's 27. I call them mounts, but it's hard to describe. They're launchers, but they're also described as mounts. They just have 28 cells. Okay, that's we'll just call that 28 cell mounts. Cells, sort of a 28 cell launcher mount. For 4.7-inch AA rockets. Katsuragi has 4 30 cell mounts, and all the others had 6 30 cell mounts of 4.7-inch AA rockets. It's a nice thing to have. They do have some deck armor, 25mm, so spinner protection, I suppose. And Katsuragi and Asso had a 50mm 2-inch belt. All the rest had a 46mm 1.8-inch mount. So Katsuragi and Asso being built by the Kure Naval Yard, to me, someone in Kure is going, so losing 2 knots and dropping down to 104,000 shaft horsepower allows us to make it up to 2-inch armor belt. I can see where the idea is coming from. I just don't really see where 2 inches versus 1.8 inches, or 50mm versus 46mm, to put in that methodology, really gives you much of an advantage. Because there isn't much that 2 inch is going to stop that 1.8 inch wouldn't. In fact, I'm trying to think of weapons in service, and there's virtually nothing that 2 inch will stop that 1.8 inch wouldn't. It's just not a material advantage. But we carry on, and this is Katsuragi. She got to 84% complete, and she is being built at the Mitsubishi Nagasaki shipyard. The construction stopped on the 1st April 1945. Now, all these ships, they look pretty darn useful. They're missing aircraft, but they all look pretty darn useful. If they got into service, would they be useful? Yes. if they'd had aircraft. I highly doubt they'd have got aircraft, and here is Amagi, Heavenly Castle, named for Mount Amagi, built by Mitsubishi in Nagasaki as well. Mitsubishi in Nagasaki is an interesting one for carrier construction, seeing as whilst Mitsubishi themselves had built carriers before for the Imperial Japanese Navy, that had been at Yokohama, not Nagasaki. In fact, this is the first time this yard was used for carrier construction for any sort of major construction like that. And bringing it into the carrier program was a really good way to grow their capacity. They still were going to use Kobe, that's Kawasaki shipyard, they still used Kure, and they still used the Yokosuka shipyard. They didn't use all the shipyards which were built carriers, but they certainly were working through them. Anyway, Shane's book log time. Now, why did I choose a class of which, let's be honest, 3 members sort of get into service? 3 members. One of which is sunk by USS Redfish, that's the Unryū. The Amagi, which is sunk by an air raid but then salvaged and scrapped. And the Katsuragi, which basically gets into service to be primarily used to return Japanese personnel and Japanese nationals to Japan after war ends. Why am I doing that as a key class? Honestly, it's partially because of that book I mentioned earlier, which said they were copies of the British Light Fleet Carrier. They weren't. They really weren't. They were a similar response to a similar situation, but they weren't copies. And also because one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about lately with Japan, and especially after we came back from the trip in Japan, is how much industrial potential they actually had and how much they squandered with politics, pettiness, infighting, arguing in the run-up to World War II. I'm not saying they could have changed the result. They really couldn't have. There was always going to be, there's no doubt in my mind, any scenario, any war which they end up picking, whether it was with the British Empire or America, either way, they don't have the industrial capacity to win those wars. Then the industrial capacity of the other 2 groups is just too high. It's sometimes weird when you start explaining that, because America's quite easy to do the industrial capacity of, because it's one nation and you can see all these stats. The British Empire is the whole of the empire. It's Canada, it's Australia, it's India, it's South Africa, it's all the other parts of it, and Britain as well. Those are 2 massive global powers in their period, and I always use the phrase global power, not superpower. I know people like to go through history and go, well, this was this period's superpower. They weren't. We have a definition for a superpower. It involves nuclear weapons. Not all superpowers are global powers. Not all global powers are global powers don't have to be superpowers. A global power means that you have the power you have the ability as a nation to project your power globally. In a conventional sense, i.e. non-nuclear weaponry. These days, attributes of global power we'd be looking for are aircraft carriers, large air transport commands, or logistics and supplies sorted out for around the world, those sort of things. There are nations which are working on becoming global powers. They're not quite there yet, but they're heading in that direction. There are nations which are global powers. And a global power does not mean you're necessarily the most powerful fighting force. It means you can deploy your fighting force wherever you need in the world. It's worthwhile thinking about that. But again, if we go back to the light fleet carriers, again, when you consider all the facilities that were involved in their construction and what they really needed, kind of like cruisers and escorts and destroyers, you start getting the idea that Japan was so focused on their big ship, big gun doctrine of deterrence. And that is what it was. A big ship, big gun doctrine was about the deterrence. And I've done other videos about Japanese doctrine, so please go to look at those for more detail. The fact is that they do all that, they forget the reality that underpins that deterrence capability. The mass. You need to balance the quality with the quantity. And pursuing quality over all else meant they didn't have the quantity when they needed it. And it's always such a tempting thing to go for, because this is the best. It's the easiest thing to sell. It's the best. It's going to be the world-stomping capability. This is going to be the biggest, meanest, toughest, all the top tech. Everything. And that's a real easy sell to make to someone. But going, what we really need is something of roughly average capability, average quality, and we need a large number of them. You're going, why are you building average? Why? Because that's what you need in volume. Because that's what you can usually make in volume. There is a reason average is average. It's usually the median point. It's usually the point where things work out, and this is a good price point that we can produce enough of them at scale. Are they world beaters? Well, if you take someone who is above average in every category and you put them against someone who's average, they're going to win. They should do anyway. But the thing is, someone who's above average in every category, put them against 3 or 4 average, and they probably lose that fight. All other things being equal. I know there's a great scene in movies whenever the hero takes on 30 people solo and wins, but the reality is 30 people walk into in with guns into a situation, or 30 warships that are, let's say, third rates go into a battle, and there's only one first rate there to fight them. That first rate's gone. It will take 1 or 2. It might even take 3 or 4. But I've still got 26 left. And it's dead. Now the thing is, if there was a first rate with some third rates backing it up, then suddenly that's a problem. That's a problem. You have 5 or 6 first rates and a dozen and a half third rates sitting there. They're going to win the fight versus the 30 third rates, because now there is enough firepower, enough first rates concentrated that they can do their taking on multiple enemies. And the thing is, you can't. The multiple enemies can't gang up on them, because that's going to leave the third rates which are supporting them unattended. It's a balanced force. But that balance is always difficult to sell, because people go, well, I could just build 10 first rates, and then I don't need any of the third rates. Well, you still do. You still do. And that's the interesting point we're getting into. Then we have ASO, which was, 60% complete. Now, before we go too much further on, I would like to say what I love about this particular picture is, whilst the vessel is 60% complete, you can see the lines of the hull. It's like you've been able to sort of carve off the carrier part and you're just looking at the hull. And it's an absolutely gorgeous hull. Look at the shaping, look at the lines, look at the way it flows. These ships were a very efficient design. And what's really interesting to me, is that the Ikomas were technically a simplified and sped up construction version of this. They were designed to be much easier, much quicker to build, and also more survivable against submarines. which, considering the losses the Japanese took to submarines, is understandable. But still, do not fit depth charges to an aircraft carrier. There is no scenario you want to be using them. None at all. But let's consider the air group and the things they should be using, their aircraft. So, the air groups are a really interesting illustration of Japanese thinking and evolution as war goes on. It starts off being a heavy strike force, and let's be honest, both the Unryūs and the Ikomas are a very heavy strike force, a very heavy strike group. They are 27 dive bombers, 18 torpedo bombers, or 27 torpedo bombers, and a few fighters. And the air group capacity is quite large as well. It's quite a decent sized air group. We're talking in this one, in this air group, there are 72 aircraft. That's a fairly decent air group. But then it starts to drop down. It drops down for two reasons. One, the number of available pilots is dropping, and they haven't really rectified it. They are very slow to implement the changes which are going to be needed to increase their flow of pilots and increase their flow of air crew, and also, to be honest, fitters as well for their carriers. They've lost a lot of them. That's another group which doesn't get discussed enough, but the fact is, the maintenance engineers, the fitters, the people who keep the aircraft going, they are never in enough supply to really run their carriers on a high efficiency after Midway. After Midway, they always have a shortage of fitters to deal with. In terms of trained fitters. You can have someone who's called a fitter, but let's be honest, until you've got a bit of experience and a bit of training, you're not really that good at your job, and you need a lot more oversight. And the trouble is, once you've had the losses you've had, you have to promote people up levels to give that oversight who might not have the experience to really be able in a position to give that oversight anyway. Then in 1943, it's planned to have quite a decent strike force, an improved fighter group, definitely. Mitsubishi A7Ns, really nice. They're what's supposed to replace the Zero. And Nakajima C6Ns, reconnaissance variants, reconnaissance aircraft. And then by August 1944, it's changed back to Zeros for fighters because, well, the A7M just isn't becoming available as you need it to be. It isn't coming in the speed you need it to be. So it's not going to be there. And, well, strike aircraft, yeah, you've got 12 Yokosuka D4Ys, they're starting to come into service, and 9 Nakajima B6Ns. But let's be honest, originally you were planning for 15 more dive bombers, if we consider the Ikoma class or earlier, and at least double the number of torpedo bombers, and whilst you've doubled the number of fighters, more than, you can argue, and from the original Unryūs, your air group is, what, 48? Surely you could be able to put more aboard. And you could take more aboard the carriers. Just, you don't have the air crew for them and you don't have the aircraft available. So you've got carriers going around which are functionally half empty. That's also one of the reasons why the carriers are stopped when they are, or paused when they are. They are paused in November 1944. Because there's no point completing carriers if you haven't got the air groups for them. And they took notice that they were going to need more carriers a lot earlier than they started working on increasing the pilot supply. A lot earlier. Which takes us to Katsuragi, which is the one which has the, I would argue, longest service experience of any of them. She spent most of her time wandering around the ports of the inland sea until she arrived in Kure in February 1945 and had to be camouflaged. Her flight deck's described as being disguised with trees, houses, roads, but the AA batteries are fully manned. Why is this happening? Because her air group has been committed to the Battle of Iwo Jima and isn't available. And then she's attacked by aircraft from Task Force 58, lightly damaged. Task Force 38, though, decides to do more damage. They do 2 raids, 24th and 28th of July. And it's their second raid where they managed to hit with a 2,000-pound bomb. They do a lot of damage between elevators, and there's a lovely picture here which shows some of the damage that was caused. And this explosion does a lot of damage to the vessel, but she doesn't really ever get active, therefore. She survives the war, and she's designated a special transfer ship, as said, and she then spends the rest of her time, when she's not being repaired to make her watertight, she spends her time wandering around doing the collection of people, and returning them to Japan, until eventually she's stricken from the Navy list in November 1946. And she starts scrapping in December 1946, and that scrapping isn't completed till November 1947. And in many ways, I would say she is probably, for me, one of the sadder losses, because there is an alternate history there where if she'd still been sitting around and hanging around till Korea, probably she gets used, and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force gets an aircraft carrier. And I know, constitutionally, that's not supposed to happen at that time, but considering how much the US and others depend on the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force activating forces to support them in Korea, they basically do so much of the minesweeping, it's beyond belief, that, frankly, I could see them going, right, you can have this carrier as a forward aviation support ship, as some sort of asset to assist with not helicopters in Korea, but, well, there are some helicopter-like aircraft around that could be being used, but, you know, I could see them activating quite a lot of stuff if she hadn't already gone. She was a very useful asset. Ikoma here illustrates the difference between the Ikoma design and the true Unryū design, in that, look at that hull shaping. Look at what they've done to simplify construction, make things easier, versus this hull, the Aso. Look at the shaping and the form. Yes, this is easier to build. It is easier to build. But it isn't as efficient a hull. And I have no doubt that the Unryūs might officially has been aimed for 34 knots, but I think they, like the Kure built ships of the Unryū's class, well, I think the Ikomas will probably get closer to 32 knots with that hull shaping. I really do. But she was 60% complete, and that's the really interesting thing. When we consider the class, when we think about them, the fact is the Japanese have potentially, they have Katsuragi, which is 84% complete, when she's cancelled in April. Cancelled in April 1945. Aso was 60% complete when she was cancelled in November 1944. So you've got 2 carriers who could have been pretty much complete. And you've got Ikoma, which is cancelled in November 1944 as well. And you have Karama, which is cancelled on the 5th of May 1944. Now, if you consider Ikoma, Aso, and Kasagi, they're all probably potentially completed in 1945. Potentially completed in 1945. But there's no need to do that, because you've got no air group for them. You've got no air group for them. And the Americans are getting ever closer. The Allies are coming in now. The war is over in Europe, and they are heading their forces out towards you. So no longer are you just going to be facing the full might of the North American continent, you're going to be facing the full might of the European continent and all of the British Empire. A might which is not restricted by having to go around Africa as well as through the Indian Ocean, but which can dogleg through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. These are useful ships, but they're not in time. They're not in time. And I suppose that's the question for you, and I'm going to ask you this. I don't think it changes the outcome of the war, and I really do want to emphasize this. I don't think there's many results which change the outcome of the war, but what happens to American and British policy if when the Japanese leave the naval treaties, they start a light fleet carrier program immediately? If in 1937 they start laying down a whole generation of light fleets, what do you think the response is? What do you think the response from other nations is? It's always interested me as an idea, because the Japanese have the yards and they have the capacity. They can't do maybe massive full fleet carriers, but light fleet carriers they could do a decent production run of. And this class could have been really useful. If you go back to this, the Katsuragi, it gives you a really good illustration of what they could have provided. What they could have been. And again, they're not massive. They are well under 20,000 tons. You know, you've got the yard space, you've got the dry dock space. You could have built quite a number of these, using some of the facilities which weren't being fully utilized. And starting in 1937, when you're no longer part of the treaty system, you're not breaking any rules. And you could even argue that you're doing a carrier build-up, but the carriers are respecting the Second London Treaty because none of them are over that displacement. I just think it would be an interesting thing to see. It would also have the interesting consequence of forcing the Japanese to start ramping up their pilot and aircrew training programs a lot earlier, and confront the reality that training them like they were elite samurai, which had worked for World War I and their previous commitments, was great for their involvement in World War I, but they needed to have a mass training program. They needed to accept the 75% pilots rather than just aiming for anyone who was 99% and above. Be interesting to see. Anyway, that being said, what have we got coming up? Well, next week, after this one comes out, we've got Andrew Cunningham's Master of Confusion. Yes, the British Admiral who really does make Massacre of Oka his own being. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And yes, there is going to be, starting soon, you're going to start seeing the videos being scheduled for Christmas. Because again, I'll be doing a video a day. There will be a long patrol, a recorded video, either a premiere or a live every day over the Christmas period. And there will be a short as well. And I'm currently stacking those all up. Because it's that, and that's what I try and do over every Christmas period. Because I realise that for a lot of time, and a lot of people, Christmas can be an incredibly lonely period. And, well, if the videos help make it a little less lonely, then I've done my job. Thank you very much for helping, and look forward to hopefully seeing a lot of you at Historiathon when that starts off in a couple of weeks. It's a busy time for me, it really is. But it's fun. Thank you.